Okay, everybody, thank you for coming. Let's go ahead and get started. So my name is Jake Heileman. I'm a master's student in the Energy Graduate Group at UC Davis, and one of the leaders, along with my colleagues, Anish Sinha and Jean G, of Student Energy at UC Davis, which is a graduate student organization founded in 2019 at UC Davis. Our mission is to build a community of energy leaders, foster exchange of cross-disciplinary knowledge about energy, and take action to accelerate the transition to a resilient, decarbonized, equitable energy future. We are a chapter of a global nonprofit called Student Energy, which has chapters, it's actually based in Canada, but has chapters all over the world. And if you're interested in finding out more about our chapter, you can go to Student Energy Davis, which I will put in the chat, .org. And there we have links to previous webinars and other resources. So today we have two really exciting guests. I'll introduce them in a second. And our conversation will kind of touch on climate, political economy, and climate politics in the Green New Deal era. So first of all, I just want to acknowledge the ongoing struggle for racial justice that's occurring everywhere right now in our country. And just want to have a moment of solidarity with everyone risking their health and safety during a global pandemic to resist and protest police brutality and racial injustice. And I think we all need to do whatever we can to support this movement, including protesting, donating to bail funds, etc. And we'll hopefully, towards the end, definitely dig into kind of the connection between the struggle for racial justice and climate justice, because they're certainly connected. So today, quick housekeeping note, please keep your microphone on mute. And if you have questions, you can put them in the chat window directly to me, Jake Heileman. And that way, towards the end, for the question answer, I can curate those questions from the chat. Alrighty, so we have two guests today. We have Professor Fran Moore, who's an assistant professor of environmental science and policy at UC Davis. Fran works at the intersection of environmental economics and climate science. Her research seeks to improve our understanding of the economic and social impacts of climate change to better understand our ability to adapt to those impacts. She does this by combining econometric analyses, experimental approaches, climate model outputs, and economic modeling. We also have Professor Leah Stokes, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and Environmental Studies Department at UC Santa Barbara. Leah works on energy, climate, and environmental politics within American politics. Her work focuses on representation and public opinion, voting behavior, and public policy, particularly at the state level. Within environmental politics, she researches climate change, renewable energy, water, and chemicals policy. Leah's new book, Short Circuiting Policy, which I would highly recommend, examines the role that utilities have played in promoting climate denial and rolling back clean energy laws. Leah is also well known on energy and climate Twitter and has done everyone a service many times by tweeting out highly detailed threads about presidential climate policies and other important issues. without further ado, I think we can kind of start by, Leah, you can give us sort of the main takeaways that you've kind of come up with after researching this, the content in your latest book. I know that you were recently planning the book tour and that it got canceled because of the pandemic. But so thank you very much for making time today. And I think the sort of main takeaway from the book that I got was that there's sort of this sense that people will often take for granted the decarbonization of the US electric grid. They'll say, well, this is the first step and we need to do that, and we need to then do a lot of other things. But you've done a really good job of pointing out that that is not a given, and that decarbonizing the US electrical grid is a difficult struggle full of tons of political fights.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me. I think I may share a few slides because there's some visuals from my book, and then we can move into a conversation or have Fran present some stuff too. So I'll share my screen at this moment. So I'm going to talk about my book, and I'm going to link it to the Green New Deal and the struggle for racial justice, because I'm sure a lot of people are thinking about that right now. And climate action is not separate from racial justice. So why do I say that? That seems to have been sort of a new idea for a lot of people, but it's not a new idea within the environmental justice field. This is just one amazing paper from last year, Tessem et al. I'd recommend you look it up, which basically showed that white people receive a lot of the benefits from society creating pollution. You know, we get cars and goods and services, and we get a lot of benefits from it. But those costs are disproportionately put, and that particular paper was on Hispanic and Black communities. But there's lots of other research about Indigenous communities and other racialized communities in the United States. So, you know, white people get the benefits of pollution, all the goods and services, and Black and brown people get the pollution. And we have been seeing during the COVID crisis that African Americans are much more likely to die from coronavirus, and that's for a number of reasons, like less access to healthcare, poverty, etc. But one reason is because of air pollution. This is a respiratory illness, and it makes people who have respiratory diseases more likely to die. You know, people have been talking about Eric Garner, who was the man killed several years ago, saying famously, "I can't breathe." And all of you have re-seen this with George Floyd in the past week. But, you know, his daughter, I believe Friday was supposed to be something like her 30th birthday, and she died at very young age because of air pollution, basically, because a lot of her family members had borne the costs of pollution on their own health. And many people in that family, the Garner family, have had their lives cut short by air pollution. So, you know, across the country, a lot of Black and brown and Indigenous Americans face much worse air quality. And of course, you know, a lot of people said, why does the Green New Deal link to racial or justice or economic equality? Well, wealthy people have much larger carbon footprints. And, you know, income is not distributed equally. Black women in particular are paid very little compared to white men. And there are lots of other differences in the wage gap. And, you know, that also affects how much they're polluting. So, you know, the Green New Deal is about making those links between income inequality, racial inequality, and climate justice. And I think it's a really smart move within our development of how we talk about climate policy. I just want to say that I just published a paper. We haven't really released it publicly yet. I mean, it is public, you can get it, but we haven't really known when's the right moment to release it. And it seems like there's never a moment right now. But the point is, we actually did an experiment to understand if the Green New Deal as an idea increases public support. Is the public more supportive of climate policy if it's linking itself to income inequality and healthcare and other kinds of struggles for justice? And the takeaway is the answer is yes. So this is a conjoint experiment. Basically what we're showing people is different policy combinations and asking which one they like more. And what you can see is that particularly among Democrats, including things like healthcare or a $15 minimum wage, that really increases support for climate policy. And the same is true of a job guarantee, for example. This is an idea that every American could have a job who wanted one. And right now, I think one of the reasons we can understand why there's so much unrest and people are in the streets, apart from, racialized violence, is also the unemployment rate. And, something like 1 in 5 Americans right now is not employed, and that rate is really a lot higher for Black Americans again. So, if people don't have jobs, it's a difficult situation for them. So allowing our government to actually take a steering wheel position and drive our economy and make sure that people can have good paying jobs is a really good idea that can be done in a Green New Deal package. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. And I'll also say that we looked at how support broke down along racial lines. And the takeaway is that these ideas are even more popular among communities of color than they are among white people. You see this in poll after poll that while we might have stereotypes that the environmental movement is very white and many of the leadership in the movement is white, from a public perspective, actually, Hispanic Americans and African Americans are very supportive. And in part, that's because they're bearing the disproportionate burden of pollution. These are the frontline communities, right? So that's just what this shows as well. So if you were wanting to build a coalition to pass climate policy in 2021, linking it to other struggles for justice, including income inequality, healthcare, racial justice, it's actually a good idea, is what our research shows. I just want to say too, that a lot of people don't know what they can do in this moment. Maybe you don't feel comfortable protesting. And I say a lot in the climate movement that I don't believe in the fixation on individual behavior change. I don't believe in shaming yourself if you're not vegetarian or you took an airplane flight or whatever it is. And I think that's because climate is an institutional problem. And I'm going to talk about all the reasons why that is when I turn to my book. But the same is true to a large part, of course, not entirely, but to a large part, the struggle for racial justice is about reforming institutions. It's about policy and political change. So I would like to invite you all to do a few things, even if you're not comfortable leaving your home to protest. You can write to your local police department. You have a police department, you can write to them. I did that today. You can write to your local government. I also did that today. You might not know what to write. Well, there are Black Lives Matter campaigns, just like there are climate campaigns all across this country. And I found one without even looking for Santa Barbara, and I did what they were asking. I did their requests. So go find those wherever you live in Davis, and write those emails. That's not a difficult thing to do. And I know from my own research that our elected officials and politicians often underestimate public support for things, so they might not believe that the public is supportive of the protesters. And so what you can do is, by speaking out, you can show that the public is supportive of the protesters. And that can involve defunding the police or giving them, lower budgets, things like that. And it's really interesting for those who study local politics to see how much money is going towards law enforcement as compared to things like, climate adaptation or infrastructure or public transit or all these other things. So, there are justice implications from a climate perspective too, for our constant fixation on the police. I have a good friend who runs Black Lives Matter, or used to run and founded Black Lives Matter Toronto, and she's been putting out data on the fact that 2 times as much of the local budget is going towards the police than is going towards public transit, a low carbon transit, right? As was already mentioned, you can donate to bail funds, you can donate to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And here's a fun one I found today. The current incumbent representative in New York 16, I think it is said a terrible thing on a hot mic today that he didn't care about these issues. And he has a primary challenger backed by Justice Democrats, which is the same group that backed Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. His name is Jamal Bowman. And you can give him money or you can donate your time to help with get out the vote, because I believe his election is June 23rd. And he is a Green New Deal champion. So those are just some ideas that I leave you with. You don't have to do any or all of them, but I think because I believe in institutional change, I wanted to provide some ideas for what institutional change looks like in this moment. So institutional change on climate. I will try to go fast so I don't eat all of Fran's time. My book talks a lot about what is necessary on the climate crisis. And I came up with, while I was at the end of writing the book, I tried to figure out a benchmark of where we need to be versus where we are. And somebody on the internet called it the Narwhal curve. But basically what it is you figure out how much time do we have and how clean is our electricity system and how fast do we need to go. And if you were to say that we wanted to clean up the electricity system by 2050, which was a time period that a lot of people were talking about before the primary, you might think we're on track because we have about 36% clean electricity in 2018. And if you just take a straight line between 2000 and 2050, each year we have to grow clean electricity by 2 percentage points, right? Because that's 100 percentage points divided by 50 years, 2 percentage points. Okay, we're on track. Well, what you should notice here is that nuclear and hydropower make up a massive amount of our carbon-free electricity. And those are not growing shares. If anything, nuclear is phasing out. And so those are likely to shrink. And the green bars at the top there, that's not growing very quickly. The best year ever for renewables was 1.3 percentage points. So that means we're behind even a 2050 benchmark because we're not hitting that 2 percentage points a year. Now, what if we made our benchmark 2030, as Bernie Sanders and others have been talking about, or 2035? Well, we're very far behind that. And in fact, the benchmark shouldn't even be 100% clean electricity. And I often pause and ask why, but I won't make you all guess. The point is, in order to clean up our transportation and our building sectors, we have to electrify them, which means we actually need more of the energy in society to move into the electricity system, which means we need to grow the grid, meaning we need more capacity, we need more transmission lines. There's a lot of new stuff. And so the goal is actually not really 100% clean electricity. It's like 150% to 200%. Because depending on how much energy efficiency grows, we basically have to double the grid. So the scale of this challenge is massive, and we are decades behind. Oops, wrong direction. There were a lot of federal policy failures. We have a moment, hopefully, in 2021 where we can have success. But you know, we have not had federal government action, and instead, which is what my book focuses on, we have had a piecemeal approach at the state level. The policies that I talk about are renewable portfolio standards and net metering laws. These are the bedrock policies at the state level that have propelled action on clean electricity. And again, to bring it back to the question of racial justice, this is what the map looks like. This may not be exactly the most up-to-date one, but what should you notice about this map? These clean electricity standards basically do not exist in the Southeast, you know, where a lot of Black people live. Indeed, there are maps. I wish I had put one in. I have a new report coming out at the Southern Economic Advancement Project about this issue. You can look up maps where for all the coal plants that continue to operate in the Southeast that are literally uneconomic, meaning that every hour they operate, they lose money. They cost people more, ratepayers more money. And of course, they pollute the air and poison people's lungs, but they continue to operate because these utilities have an enormous amount of power in the Southeast, and there's no kind of market or anything like that. And so they don't have to shut down their coal plants. So what I document in the book is all the ways that electric utilities and fossil fuel companies have been resisting the clean energy transition. And they use a variety of tactics to undermine progress. That's things like lobbying, but also resisting the implementation of laws. So it's one thing to write the laws on paper. It's another thing to implement them in practice. Primary challengers can be used to do great things like What I mentioned is happening right now in New York with Jamal Bowman or with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But most often, what they are used is by the fossil fuel industry and electric utilities to primary challenge Republicans who are willing to do something on climate change. And that happens a lot at the state level, and I documented that in the book. Electric utilities have also been running these fake grassroots campaigns where they pretend like there's public outrage or that the public is on their side when it's actually a lie. So for example, in New Orleans, an electric utility called Entergy literally spent, I think, about $25,000 hiring actors to show up to a local city council meeting where a gas plant was being approved and to pretend like they hated solar and they really liked gas. So that's the kind of disingenuous tactics that are being used by utilities. And they also, of course, use the courts to resist implementation. So the book advances this idea called policy feedback, which is the idea that oftentimes when we pass laws, we don't really know what we're doing. I'd like to draw your attention to the CARES Act, passed maybe 6 weeks ago now. This was one of the stimulus bills or the relief bills. That bill has been used a lot to bail out the fossil fuel industry. And I don't think a lot of people voting on it understood the extent to which that would be happening. So, a lot of times we don't know what's happening. In the early days, the clean energy revolution, the advocates had that dynamic working in their favor because opponents, namely electric utilities and fossil fuel companies, didn't understand that a renewable portfolio standard would undercut their power. And so they kind of let things sneak through that they wouldn't have otherwise in hindsight. And in part, this ambiguity happens because in climate policy and energy policy, you have overlapping federal and state jurisdiction, meaning that there are incentives at the federal level, like the investment tax credit and the production tax credit. And those ended up getting combined with policies at the state level, like the net metering laws and the RPSs, in these creative ways, which unlocked entirely new industries. And people didn't anticipate that in advance. So in my book, I have lots of quotes from the work that I did with interviews of people basically saying that. I'll also say that my book is meant to shed light on the ways that electric utilities have promoted climate denial and delay on addressing this issue. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the work of people like Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, their book Merchants of Doubt, or Jeffrey Supran's work with Naomi about what Exxon knew. They have a great paper in Environmental Research Letters on that. But what you probably don't know is that electric utilities were right there alongside fossil fuel companies doing the same thing. And so I try to document that in my book. This is one of the first histories written about this issue. And yeah, it's been pretty fascinating. And I have a whole additional research project on this topic right now where we are gathering all the documents related to utilities and what they knew and their relationship to climate denial campaigns and coding them all, and we're going to do a paper on that. And if you want to read a summary of that and you don't have a copy of my book, it's published on Drilled News. So I'm just going to say how to get a copy. The book has been kind of sold out, which is a combination of great reception and coronavirus supply chain problems. So I'll just explain it. If you want to get a copy, the best thing to do is to go to the Oxford University Press website. It's bit.ly/scp-book. There's a discount code here. I'll put it in the chat afterwards. That gives you 30% off. So it's basically like $20. And it's going to tell you that it's not going to ship because it's back ordered, but eventually it will ship and you will eventually get a copy. It does take time. If you are impatient and you want a copy yesterday, you can also get a Kindle ebook. It's bit.ly/scp-kindle, and it's on sale for whatever absurd reason I do not know. So you can get it for $12. So that's great. And I'm really, I don't really make a lot of money selling these books. So it's not about me making money. It's actually more about getting the ideas out there. And so I hope you check it out if it's interesting to you and talk about it with others. So that was me talking. Sorry if I went on long, but I hope it was a fruitful conversation that sort of stimulated some ideas for Fran and everybody else.
Thank you. So one thing that you talk about in the book is you kind of lay out several examples of utilities resisting clean energy in Arizona and Texas, in Ohio, and other places. And you make the point that many kinds of utilities can be bad on clean energy, both investor-owned utilities that are regulated by a PUC, Public Utilities Commission, and public utilities such as municipal or rural electric co-ops. So we're seeing a renewed sort of call for public energy, public power, with some proponents of the Green New Deal centering that notion. And you kind of push back on that, saying that, you know, there's no guarantee if it's public that it'll be lead to clean energy. So I guess my question is, given that you kind of make the point that utilities are so critical to this clean energy transition, what is your kind of positive vision for utilities? What are some examples you can point to of either utilities or PUCs that are doing well, and how can we push to get there? What should the Sunrise Movement and the Green New Deal be demanding out of their PUCs and out of their utilities?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jake. So for those of you who are in the weeds on this stuff, which I guess maybe a bunch of you, there have been these campaigns, including in the Bay Area, around PG&E's bankruptcy, to break up, for example, PG&E into smaller territories and make them municipally owned utilities. I don't support those efforts generally because not because I think PG&E is some great corporation. I do not. But, you know, PG&E is a really large service territory, and you have a lot of customers spread over a lot of space. And if you, for example, cleave off San Francisco, which was an offer on the table last year, if anybody can remember time at this point, you know, that would put a lot of the wildfire risk and costs onto all the territory, maybe even including Davis. And so, you know, I just think that given the system that we have today, we have to be careful about how we think about how that system evolves, including for equity reasons, because right now there are a lot of costs related to cleaning up the grid and making sure that it's not sparking fires in the Bay Area. And you know, those should be done. There are also costs related to the clean energy transition. And overall, the utilities in California, compared to many other states, have not been as resistant in the recent years to, for example, increasing the renewable portfolio standard. So right now, California has a target for 100% clean electricity standard, and the utilities are marching along towards that without an enormous amount of resistance. Although it's not in my book, I've done the whole history of California's clean electricity standards, and I just haven't written it up yet. So, you know, I don't think that it solves the problem in this case. If we were to go back to like 1905 when utilities were set up, would I have set them up as public entities? Probably. But, you know, we also set up some entities like the Tennessee Valley Authority. And if you want to understand why, like, some of the history of the Tennessee Valley Authority, I would recommend reading this book, Superpower by Russell Gold, in which he documents a clean energy entrepreneur trying to build a transmission line to build a bunch of renewables, and the TVA just blocking him endlessly. And this is a government-owned agency. You know, similarly, if you know about Colorado, there's a rural electric co-op there called Tri-State that's been quite terrible. They've had some good announcements since January, but they maintain massive amounts of coal infrastructure. And so it's just not clear to me that the ownership structure is the critical variable to making progress. And we have so little time to make progress that think about when the economists back in the 70s and 80s started their reform agenda for utilities. They wanted to create markets, right? And they had a lot of power, and they actually restructured some electricity systems. And it didn't all go according to their plans. It didn't happen everywhere. And so I just don't know if we have time at this moment in time to do that versus saying, imposing targets on utilities and making them clean up their act. And that's where I think federal action is so important. In terms of some bright lights, one thing I'd say is that California, one of the reasons why it's so successful, in my opinion, is the intervener compensation program, which is a policy that pays advocates for their work in the public interest. You have to remember that if you're a private monopoly utility, whatever your costs are to advocate for your interests, they're paid for. And that isn't the same for, you know, people advocating for renewables or lower electricity rates, except for in California, where the intervener compensation program exists. So it basically pays groups to advocate. And that policy doesn't exist in most states. More broadly, I don't actually think we have a well-defined public utility commission reform agenda. And I've been saying this to advocates. It's something that I'm interested in working on, but I think, we have the world is defined by utilities, and we're often in this trying to just battle their constant attacks on the progress that we've made. And we see that so clearly in the Trump administration. And then we have this radical idea of completely throwing out the baby with the bathwater and getting rid of the whole system in terms of this sort of public ownership idea. But like, what is the middle way? What is the idea for how we make as much progress as possible with the system that we have, with all its good and ills? And I don't think anybody has an answer to that question. Some people talk about performance-based regulation, but then they say, oh, it's kind of shitty, sorry to swear. So yeah, I don't think we know the answer to that. And I think we do need to know the answer to that, with the one caveat that one answer is federal action through a clean electricity standard, which I am 100% supportive of.
So kind of jumping into the federal action question, since you've started the book, between then and now, I think a lot of the politics have shifted at the national level, pretty drastically, to the point where there was, every Democratic president was putting out quite ambitious plans, policy platforms on climate. And, we've sort of gone through the primary now. It seems like there was a Dave Roberts article a couple days ago, saying that at last a climate policy platform that can unite the left, and kind of arguing that there has been a little bit of a coming together of this sort of Jay Inslee folks and some of other think tanks, Data for Progress or Blue Green Alliance. Do you think, first of all, what do you think are the policy planks that the majority of people on the left are in agreement on? And do you think that agreement will endure, or do you think it's has sort of a lot of pitfalls?
Yeah, so that article by David Roberts in Vox put forward a policy approach that I fully support, which is the standards investment justice approach. It's the Green New Deal approach with, I guess, some specificity around what that entails. And I think it really does come out of the Democratic primary and out of the campaigns of Jay Inslee, but also Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, and even to some extent Joe Biden. So, the idea is that we set standards. We say, this is where we need to go. And when you think about climate change as a problem, when you have such a short time period, you kind of have to say, this is where we need to go. It's also just industrial policy, right? It's the government saying we need to steer society in a certain direction. And I think it's the approach that we've seen work at the state level with renewable portfolio standards, or what we now tend to call clean electricity standards, so that nuclear is included in it. That approach has worked really well. We could also think about putting together building standards to do the same thing. Zero emission vehicle standards, right? CAFE standards are some version of that, but they got to go to the next level where we're not using internal combustion engine cars anymore. So, it's a way of saying, here's what needs to happen. Industry, whether that's utilities, auto manufacturers, construction companies, you got to make this happen. And I think that is a good approach. The second idea is investments. What we've seen is that the government can make change if it chooses to. This is what happened in World War II. It's what happened with, the Moonshot Initiative. Sometimes people ask me if I feel hopeful about climate change. And the reason why I feel hopeful is that we've never actually tried to solve the problem. We've tried to solve the problem, but we've never gotten to the second step. It's not like fossil fuel companies and electric utilities haven't even allowed us to try. They've never even allowed us to get the Waxman-Markey bill through the Senate and even try to implement it. So I feel like if we could have a big banner year in 2020 with an election where the Senate has a new balance and that we have a new White House, that we could actually try, and that if we get the rules on the books and if we invest with standards, that we will make progress. And the last thing is, of course, justice, which for all the reasons I outlined earlier in my talk, I think is really central. Black and brown and indigenous people are bearing the brunt of both air pollution and climate change. And they're the ones on the front lines who are going to be deeply impacted. You see this in, for example, Puerto Rico with Hurricane Maria. You see it all across the South in terms of what sea level rise is already doing to communities. There's a great book called Rising by Elizabeth Rush. I think it was a shortlist for the Pulitzer, a runner-up, or I don't know, but it's a great book. It was our UCSB Reads book this year. And you can learn a lot about indigenous communities living in Louisiana who are already facing sea level rise. So, I think that justice really matters. And, justice also matters for like fossil fuel workers, where a lot of times fossil fuel companies go bankrupt and they abandon oil wells and just pollution, and they don't pay pensions and they don't pay workers. And so we actually need our government to say like, hey, we're going to have a job for you. We're going to drive this transition. So, that's kind of the new approach. It's going to involve spending money. But I guess I feel like we've seen through COVID that we're more than capable of spending money. And unfortunately, a bunch of that money's been spent on bailing out failing fossil fuel companies. So yeah, that's sort of the new approach. And I would be curious too to hear what Fran thinks about that approach.
So yeah, that's a good transition. So Fran, you're a climate economist. So I think some of your work focuses on the social cost of carbon and kind of calculating the damages, but I think also looking at the policies from an economic point of view. What's your perspective on Leah's framing of the Green New Deal and the kind of policy moment that we're in as an economist?
Yeah, so I think maybe, well, firstly, thanks to Leah for a great presentation and a great book, which I'm like halfway through. I was hoping to finish it for today, but not quite.
It's an academic book as much as you're a gold star, Fran, so great job.
Yeah, so I was thinking about why I was so excited about this conversation, and I think it really boils down to just kind of some frustrations, I think, with the kind of academic economics of kind of climate change that have been, I think, kind of percolating in my brain for a while, and it was kind of a good opportunity to kind of put them down a little bit more explicitly. And so I could just kind of run through them and then kind of run through why I think I think I largely agree with a lot of what Leah said. So so I think a lot of academic economics on climate really focus on this carbon price idea, particularly at the national level, right? Or even at the international level. And they, economics, like, when it comes to the international level, we do kind of like think about strategy and politics and game theory. We kind of recognize this as not like a social planner, but when it comes to the national level, we really kind of retain the fiction of a kind of welfare maximizing like social planner who is kind of willing and able to kind of implement a kind of efficient welfare maximizing policy. And it's just increasingly clear that like that's just not true, right? And there are these very large, powerful interests at stake that are kind of playing a strategic game here. And they've largely been winning it. And it's kind of relief for me, kind of feeling frustration with this, to see it kind of like these real, questions of power and how they play out in these settings, being kind of explicated by Leah and kind of people she works with too. I think, this kind of now like decades old, like somewhat kind of obsession with carbon pricing is frustrating to me. And like the reason why, and I was thinking about why this is, and so economists like there's a reason economists like carbon prices, right? Economists like carbon prices because they're efficient, right? And what that means is they're gonna maximize kind of total benefits. The kind of net benefits are maximized, so you should be able to distribute the gains from that in such a way to make everyone better off. If kind of you're gonna reach this kind of Pareto optimal point. But like we don't require efficiency of like any other public goods provision that the government does, right? Like we require it pass a cost benefit test, right? And there are lots of policies that are not efficient that pass a cost benefit test. And if a if a policy passes a cost-benefit test, right, that means it's welfare improving, right? It means it's not as welfare improving as it would be if it had been efficient, right? But it still makes people better off, right? And so the question is not like, is it efficient? It's like, does the benefits exceed the cost, right? And there's a lot of expensive policies out there that, maybe they're not efficient, but they probably do pass the cost benefit test, right? And the question is like, how bad are the damages from climate change? And we've known for an awful long time that the damages are, that there are damages and they're real. And then, the work that I do, that people like Sol Shang, Michael Greenstone are doing right now to kind of, frankly, that work was neglected for several decades in terms of really trying to quantify the damages from climate change and to understand what we know about climate change impacts in terms of welfare. But, there's a lot of reasons why the social cost of carbon is higher than like, the kind of $40 per ton number that is kind of the official US government number now. There's a lot of reasons that it's probably higher than that. And there's a lot of policies that you could do at $40 per ton, and there's even more that you could do at numbers that are higher than that. Okay, I've got like 3 more, sorry.
I'm loving this. I'm like taking notes. I'm so down.
I thought you might. So if you ask why were we kind of so focused on a carbon price, right? And I think trying to understand this, and this is where I'm really just working off of like my rough understanding of the history here, which may be off. But if you kind of this kind of prioritizing this question of efficiency, right, is really one about minimizing costs, right? And that like matters if your kind of coalition of people that you're working on this climate policy with includes business interests, right? It includes kind of the people who are going to bear that cost. And they have a kind of interest in minimizing that, and therefore you're kind of going to pass a policy where they kind that the costs are going to be minimized. But it's increasingly apparent that that interest is not part of the coalition that is going to pass ambitious climate policy at the federal level in the United States. And so it shouldn't, it's kind of keeping it as a kind of overriding interest in how we design climate policy, I think is probably misguided. And instead of thinking about other kind of priorities, but this is a big complex, it's going to be a big complex piece of legislation that's going to do a lot of things, and like what those things are kind of is going to depend on the coalition of people and of interests that end up passing it. And with that, I think, turning now more to kind of the specifics that Leah was talking about, I think on the justice side of things, this question of co-benefits is like totally being like, it's totally sidelined from the discussion of climate change, in the economic sphere in a way that I think is like really kind of unhelpful and mysterious to me. And so, and the reason why the kind of economists have a theory of externalities, and it's like oh, well, it's air pollution, like you do your air pollution like Pigouvian tax, and for climate change, you do your climate change Pigouvian tax, right? And we kind of fix air pollution with air pollution policy, and we fix climate change with climate change policy. And that's just like not how things work. And like you kind of have this attitude of like, oh, well, the Clean Air Act like does air pollution. And then you look at the reality and like, so many counties are just out of compliance with the Clean Air Act standards, right? And they have been for decades at this point, right? And so this idea that like people are being protected from harmful air pollution is just not true, right? Like people are, firstly, like, places are exceeding the Clean Air Act standards, but also we know the Clean Air Act standards are too high. And there's like an awful lot of really good econometric work and from other fields doing like great data analysis to show just how damaging pollution is, particulate matter, ozone, to health, kind of long run mental health, to like life outcomes, kind of schooling. It's really bad. And economists have gotten really good at measuring just how bad it is. And because of that, you've seen this pushback from the administration around how you quantify the benefits of reducing air pollution. And you've seen that in how the kind of restrictions they've proposed on like what types of studies can be used to support kind of decisions at EPA. And you've also thought like explicit instructions not to consider co-benefits when considering in a cost benefit analysis. And for a lot of these energy regulations, like those are really key. And it's because they're so damaging. And it's just every time EPA does an analysis and does a cost benefit analysis, if you're reducing air pollution, the benefits are enormous. And so foregrounding, like these benefits are on the table, they're enormous, and they matter to communities that we care about, and that are important, in and of themselves, obviously, but also in this coalition that's going to get this climate policy passed. And why not focus on that as a key benefit of this climate policy? And then finally, getting at the investment question. This idea of like, revenue neutrality, and like you can't have like costly, you can't have this big upfront investment. I don't buy it. Well, I guess particularly now, right? Like we've seen the government's willing to take on debt. It's, they've been willing to take on debt to finance tax cuts that kind of have no kind of investment, not an investment in the future really at all, right? But there's good reasons why you should, as a government, take on debt to kind of finance investments in the future. And that's exactly what climate policy is. And, part of the political problem of climate change has always been this bargain between present and future. And, some of these benefits from climate policy will play out into the future, like, taking on debt, like shift some of the burden of paying for that into the future is not the end of the world, right? That future hopefully is going to be fairly wealthy. And more wealthy because we take action on climate change. And so I think like just thinking a bit more creatively about how we do government investment and how we pay for it like today or tomorrow is part of kind of unlocking this political path forward.
That was great, Fran. I really loved what you said. You're one of the good ones, I'd say. Matto Mildenberger, who I know talked to you guys last week, he wrote a book, which I guess he talked to you about, called Carbon Capture, where he talks about the history of carbon pricing. And we've been writing this article, and now we have to rewrite it because of coronavirus, about the trouble with carbon pricing. And it's been really funny talking to 99 out of 100 economists about this issue, not Fran, but because, when you point out that what does a carbon price actually do? A carbon price raises the cost of energy for people. That's exactly how the price signal works, right? That's how the behavior gets changed. And there are like a number of problems with that. First, climate change is a structural problem, which means that there's a lot of inelasticity in people's ability to sort of like change their behavior just because you made their lives a little more expensive. Like, I'm not necessarily going to go buy another car because you made it a little more expensive to fill it up. And you can see that a fair amount, that there's these inelasticity problems. And versus if you have an investment approach where you're literally just saying, okay, like the government is going to give you money to like go buy another car, and you're actually targeting the turnover of the fleet. It seems to me like that might work a little bit better because of this inelasticity problem. And then the other problem is inequality, where, this tax is regressive. Now, how then a lot of economists, when I say that, get upset. They say, well, everything we do is regressive. And that's what I want to nail down right here with you, Fran. It's one thing to talk about regressivity on a cost, right? Like, I feel like we should think about costs and benefits here. So here's the fact. Before the pandemic, 1 in 3 Americans struggled to pay their electricity bills, okay? You increase the cost of electricity or energy, more Americans will struggle to pay their energy bills. That's a pretty direct, very visible cost on people. Versus when we think about other kinds of climate policy, let's think about the EV tax credit, which has lots of problems from an equality perspective. But the EV tax credit, even though it's mostly going to wealthy white people in this country, it's not as directly imposing costs on everyday people trying to pay their bills, right? It's actually giving benefits to wealthier Americans. So how do you think about that, Fran? Like, how do you think about this issue of how we think about what makes climate policy more equal or unequal, and what makes it more regressive or less regressive.
Okay, 1 second. Let me just write out. Okay. Yeah. So then, oh yeah, sorry.
Economists like to get very precise about the regressivity, and then they yell at you. They feel you got
it. I think there's two relevant kind of concepts here, and I think firstly, it is right. Like it's not like economists have no role to play. Like I think understanding costs and understanding how costs do get passed on, and so there's this idea of incidence, right? Which is, look, okay, a carbon tax, you kind of like, you put it on somewhere and then it kind of filters down. But that is also true of other regulations, right? So if you have a kind of clean fuel standard, and at some margin, it's going to be constraining. And on that margin, it's going to cause costs, and those costs are going to get passed on in like complex ways to producers, to consumers, and understanding who ultimately bears that cost is like not super trivial, or even like, it depends a lot on the elasticity. It depends on the competitiveness of the sector and things like that. And so this question of incidence and like is complex, and like I'm not sure it's true that like a carbon tax is regressive and like like a kind of clean fuel standard isn't, or like a kind of like, I think like for any specific policy, it's kind of hard. It's a little kind of hard to pass. I mean, one of the reasons a carbon tax is good is like you get money and you can give that money back to people. And so like you can if you can kind of really quite fine tune like how regressive it is in its net effect. But I think it's also true, like people are like super sensitive to energy prices, or they can be, right? And like I think that's something to bear in mind, right? And it's not true. I don't think it's true that you can like kind of like totally hide the costs of climate policy somehow and like kind of make them vanish. I mean, other than like, yeah, maybe like, huge kind of like, yeah, take on a lot of debt, like give people a lot of money, like buy out those costs, shift them to the future. Like, I think there's a case to be made for that. The other important concept is like kind of opportunity cost of like in terms of public funds, right? And so this is your kind of clean car example, right? Like, we give people tax credits to buy EVs. That's great for wealthy white people who like want to go buy a Tesla. Those benefits go, very much to like, higher income brackets. What else could that money have been used for, right? But this again is very much in this mindset of like there is some kind of like limit to the government purse, and if you start to think more creatively about the role of debt and debt finance investment, right? Not spending, but investment. Then that kind of argument starts to look a little different. Sorry, that was like super long-winded.
No, that was awesome. I don't think everybody realized they were going to come to like econ conversation, but I wanted answers to these questions. So thank you, Fran.
So going off of that kind of concept of spending, it seems like the left is kind of, in some politicians have focused a lot, like AOC, on, okay, we're going to change our budget priorities. We've seen the federal government spend on these tax cuts. Why are we spending on that when we should spend on a Green New Deal? And then other people on the left are saying, well, actually, we need to think more critically about the way we think about debt in the first place, and that debt investing, as you're saying, is in fact completely viable if it returns all these benefits in the future. Do you think we should be trying to normalize deficit spending to save our planet more? Or do you think that focusing on the rhetoric of prioritization of spending is a good tactic? A question for either one of you.
Well, I'll say some brief things, and then Fran can say more econ-y things. You know, I have a friend, he's a writer for The Atlantic named Robinson Meyer, and he's been talking a lot about this, and you can read his reporting. And he's been interviewing a fair amount. Adam Tooze, who's a history prof at Columbia University, who does a lot of work on the Fed. And he's been sort of making this argument exactly like what Fran was saying, that climate change is a problem for the future. Debt is a way of carrying costs over time. And so actually it makes a lot of sense to be thinking about investments not in a sort of zero-sum way where the federal government budget is generally, not in this year, but generally about $4 trillion a year, and that's somehow a fixed pie, and you've got to, you know, find it. And that makes carbon pricing particularly attractive for the reasons that Fran was just saying, that it allows you to raise revenue, right? And then you can use that revenue, although you're using it for somehow dealing with the regressivity problem and then buying a bajillion, you know, unicorns, and who knows what you're doing, and buying off the industry. So that revenue goes away pretty quickly. And also the revenue shrinks as the carbon pollution goes down, unless the price goes up more. And anyway, it just becomes difficult. So, so I do think that there's a lot of thinking about that. And I think the COVID moment has opened that conversation up, because literally the CARES Act was more money than Joe Biden's 10-year climate plan. So, you know, I think that we have to think more about debt. Yes.
Yeah, I think the idea that the political, your political imagination has to be constrained by like kind of within this budget. Like I think it's just been shown to be a fiction, right? Like, you know, the Republicans just passed a giant tax cut that blew a hole in the budget and kind of faced no kind of, you know, political or kind of, you know, fiscal consequences because of that. And they did that to fund. They did that to just, you know, fund. No, this is not something that's gonna pay off over time, right? This is a kind of pure, like, really a pure kind of consumption. You know, whereas there are good reasons to kind of invest in our future, and that's true of climate, is true of education, is true of healthcare, right? And this gets to kind of some of the work that I've done a little bit on how climate change affects growth. And, you know, most of the, a lot of the economic models we use to model the kind of social cost of carbon kind of assume that, you know, basically, you know, the economy kind of just keeps going and the basic determinants of growth are like unaffected. And then you just kind of have this like, you know, relatively small effect on productivity. But there's some, and I'm going to say like, this is by no means convincing at the moment. This is not settled, but there's at least some evidence that climate change does affect the growth rate, that it affects the underlying kind of determinants of growth. And like, that's enormous, right? Because you don't have to have very much of that effect, and it like compounds over time, right? And if it compounds over 100 years, like, it's enormous. Like, you can have a like tiny fraction of 1% like effect, and it compounds over, you know, 100 years, and it's like enormous in anything you'd be worried about in terms of like spending today, right? And, you know, and I don't know that if that is the case, but I'm sure that it's a possibility, right? It's certainly like within the distribution of possibilities. And so I think like taking that seriously, taking these costs seriously, kind of changes the calculus about kind of what and how you should be willing to spend today to avoid it.
And like, I just want to put a star on Fran being a wonderful economist, and I appreciate how careful she was, but I 100% believe that climate change affects the growth rate. And because like, how does climate stability not underlie our entire economy? And this, I did this talk at MIT in the fall. I was on a stage with like economists, and they, you know, like, I completely respect the discipline of economics. And I think where some of the strengths are is exactly what Fran was saying. Like, look at cost benefit analyses, work that's done with air pollution experts around, you know, what are the costs to mortality, to education, to knowledge of pollution? Like, that stuff's great. But sometimes, like, just because it's not easy to run through a model, or like we want to be hesitant, we'll be like, oh, maybe not having a stable climate will affect the economy, when you're just like, what? Like, 100%, that's what's gonna matter. And the only other thing I'll say is which is not a criticism of Fran, she's just being a very good, careful economist. The other thing I'll say is there's this awesome paper that's come out since the crisis started. It's by Stieglitz and Stern and some other people. I think Hepburn might be the lead author. It's an LSE working paper. And then I think they published it somewhere. Anyway, I'd really recommend looking up that paper. And what it talks about a bunch is like why green stimulus matters so much. And they talk about the Keynesian multiplier, which is this idea that, you know, there's something called an investment, which is when you put money in and it like grows itself and creates more goods and positive things in the world. And there's something called a fossil fuel bailout, which doesn't do that, right? Like, you don't, if you have a failing fracking company, which is what was happening to a lot of these small oil and gas companies in the United States before the pandemic, and they're not in good financial shape, coal companies, things like that, then you pour money into those companies. It's like, you know, you call that a money pit. The money goes away. It doesn't multiply across the economy in the same way. And a lot of economists have done work too, where they show that if you invest in renewables, you create way more jobs than you do if you invest in these dirty industries. So, you know, how we think about where we put our money in this moment also affects sort of that investment and multiplier effect. And that's leaving aside all the externality problems too, right? Like when I say the money just goes away, I'm not even thinking about the climate impacts of subsidizing fossil fuels, the air pollution impacts, right? If we were to add up all that stuff, it would make it even worse if we put the externalities in. So, you know, these are really bad investments. And I just would direct people to look at that paper, because the craziest fact is they went across the G20 and they did a study of, you know, how much of the stimulus money in the G20 nations is going, how many policies are green versus brown. They found that 92% completely ignore climate change, 4% are green, and 4% are dirty, you know, bailing out the fossil fuel industry, et cetera. And I think what's so crazy is that decision makers, economists, not in the academy, or maybe in the academy, but people in power think economic policy is somehow separate from climate policy, and that like we do our stimulus and then like someday we do our climate thing. And like there's no more time to do that anymore, because the timeline is so short. And also economic growth and carbon emissions are tied. And the goal of doing a green stimulus is to break that relationship, to break the relationship between our economy and pollution. So all of which is to say, I'd recommend checking out that paper. It's awesome, really fascinating, and, you know, a plug for investments and not bailouts.
Yeah, I would say, like, to echo that, like, you know, this moment we're in, like, unbelievable sums of money are going out the door right now. Like, if the question of like, should we take on debt is like irrelevant. Like, we are taking on debt. We are taking on large sums, right? And for good reason, right? Like, you know, it's not like, you know, this is money that needs to be spent to kind of just maintain, you know, people's, you know, in the, you know, to just keep people going at this point. But eventually we're going to get to the point where we are thinking of stimulus. And like there will be stimulus, and it will probably be a lot of money because that's what's needed. And, you know, this is a really one-shot deal, I think, because, you know, if this doesn't get spent on the infrastructure we need to do this, you know, climate change revolution we need, like it will be followed by, you know, cuts like we saw in the austerity after we saw the Great Recession. Like we're not in a good place economically right now, and we're not going to be for a while, I think. And in those times, it's very difficult to provide public goods in general, right? Like it's just difficult to kind of come together and say we're going to do this thing that's like good for everyone. So, you know, in that, you know, sense, like I think this kind of focusing on these investments, you know, and thinking of them as stimulus, thinking of them as, you know, in terms of like investments, and also kind of solving our kind of social welfare problems, which is just, you know, so incredibly on display right now. Like thinking of that as a package that we're going to invest in the future together, you know, like this is our chance, like, and it's going to go away pretty, you know, quickly. And we're, you know, it's going to be tough economic conditions, I think, for the foreseeable future.
Totally. And if you think about what climate change does with the impacts, to extend my point that climate change definitely messes up the economy, you know, once you start having climate impacts, which we are already having, fires in California, you know, heat waves, drought in California, flooding in the Midwest leading to dams bursting, hurricanes, you know, these are climate impacts. They're linked to climate change with extreme event attribution science showing that, you know, that actually puts stress on budgets. And I feel like we haven't fully thought that through. Like, we've kind of been like, oh, we don't need to worry about, well, we can't worry about adaptation because, you know, we got to mitigate first. And that debate has played out, whatever. But really what we haven't realized is that climate impacts are going to be very expensive, and that's going to stress out already limited budgets. And I just see a potential quite negative spiral in society, unfortunately, which is such a depressing thing to say given what's happening in the world.
No,
But
I mean, there's the Stefan Halligat, who's the economist at the
yes.
World Bank Climate Change, and he has a paper for a long time ago, I think, and he models exactly the phenomenon of like a kind of repeated kind of extreme events that kind of shape the kind of fiscal conditions and kind of, you know, show this kind of downward spiral. And certainly it's kind of one of the ways, you know, if you think about how climate change could affect growth, that's absolutely one of the ways of like, you know, this opportunity cost of public funds, you're putting a whole bunch of public funds into kind of recovering from climate change impacts that otherwise would have this productive effect on the economy. And that's like a, you know, classic kind of flow down to growth.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow, we're just going depressing. I mean, if you want to look at those, the RCPs, right? Like they're within the IPCC modeling community, they have these representative concentration pathways, right? And then they have these scenarios where they imagine what the world might be like. And there are some scenarios with climate change where like we all band together and we like work through our problems. And then there are some that are just like fascism. And so, you know, we don't want to be in that world is I think the point. And I run this climate book club on Twitter for whatever bizarre reason. And in February, we read Parable of a Sower by Octavia Butler, which I don't know if people have read. But the crazy thing, apart from her being like a clairvoyant of the future, she's writing a book set in like 2020, and it's set in Southern California, and there's like a drought and racialized violence and people like, it's just, anyway, it'll disturb you if you need some disturbing. But the crazy thing is that she has a president, a sort of fascist, religious, inflamed president, which we can see yesterday, you know, saying, who runs on the campaign slogan, "Make America Great Again." I kid you not. I when I read that, I was just like, what? And when I read that, I realized like Donald Trump may also be a manifestation of climate change, which sounds like a wacky thing to say, but you know, if you think about what's happening at the border with increasing pressure of migrants from Central and South America, a lot of people are migrating from those areas because of droughts, which are in part, you know, putting migration pressure, creating violence locally, etc. So, you know, these things are not exactly separate problems, unfortunately. And that's not how we want to deal with climate change, by putting up borders and, you know, fencing people out and turning towards fascism. I think that that's a pretty bad way to go.
Yeah, I also read the Parable of the Sower, and I kind of had a climate fiction kind of reading, kind of directed reading. You know, and to me it was like the terrifying thing was like, you know, reading these books and like they're this kind of terrifying future to think about, but it's like also very plausible, like how you get here from there. And that, I think for me, that was the important thing about reading that kind of fiction, was to kind of make this future that we describe when we talk about climate change impact, but I don't think we ever really imagine it. And it kind of empathize with what it would be like to live through. And I think climate fiction for me kind of plays an important part that I had to stop after when the pandemic happened.
Yeah, I didn't actually finish Parable of the Talents, which is the sequel, not because I didn't like it, but because it's kind of hard to read right now. You know, I actually sorry, now we're doing book club, but the last book I just finished was Educated, Tara Westover. I don't know if people have read that, but oh my God, was that depressing and dark to be reading right now. It's a story of a woman growing up in an extremist family, and how she's not allowed to be educated, and it's a memoir, so it's like, and there's a lot of violence, and anyway, just like, so now I'm reading Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own, which is actually very funny, and I would recommend it. I mean, it's feminist and interesting literature, but it's humorous, so you got to get your kicks where you can these days, you know, some form of escape.
Can I ask a question of Leah?
Poor Jake, we've just signed like.
Yeah, sorry, Jake.
No, this is great. This is great.
Okay.
It's Fireside Chat with Fran and Leah. By the way, if other people have comments or questions, you could put your like name in the chat and we'll call on you or whatever. But yeah, Fran, go for it.
So I have a question, which is about utilities and the interest in this. And I kind of follow your argument about, the kind of, they've invested in these assets, the kind of like, profit maximizing, and they've kind of captured the regulators to kind of like enable that profit maximization. And, but like, we're talking about a massive increase in their market here, right? Like, if you're an electric utility and people are saying like all of building, like, is going to be electrified, the whole transportation system is going to be electrified, like, it seems like they should be kind of natural allies to this. And I wonder, like, what do they just not understand that, or it's kind of too long-term thinking, and or kind of do you have a way of explaining that?
Yeah, great question. So what Fran is pointing to is that fact that I made at the beginning with the Narwhal curve, where I said it's not really 100% clean electricity, it's like 150 or 200%, which is the largest market share. Electric utilities as a business, they don't grow very much. Like, they had a whole period, which I document in the 20th century, where they were growing and doing economies of scale and costs were falling, and like, it's this great business. And then it kind of stagnates from, the 1960s and onwards. And then you have the oil crisis and blah, blah. So I think part of the issue, and this is where sort of the fog of enactment comes in, is that electric utilities as companies are not really sort of forward-thinking, positive, innovative companies. It's not like when you graduate from a top university, you're like, I want to go work for PG&E, like, no, like, you're like, I want to go work for Apple or Google or Facebook or whatever. So I don't think that they're like attracting a lot of that young, cutting edge, new idea talent. And, the way that the process has worked for a long time is that they have these IRPs where they put together a proposal for what they're going to do. And a lot of what they do is just kind of the same thing, which used to be proposed coal plants and is now proposed gas plants. And there's a lot of skepticism within the utility community about how much renewables could actually be part of the grid, about how much we could do load balancing, depending on what the penetration of renewables is. So I think that that's kind of the cultural explanation, but there's also just a lot of monetary concerns, right? So it's kind of hard for them to think about this hypothetical growth in market share in the future. And the building electrification stuff is super new. Like, we're talking last 12 months, and it's only, if you live in like the Bay Area, it's a hip topic because of Berkeley, but like, that's really not on the agenda. And of course the gas companies are fighting that. And then car electrification, I think they just don't really believe it. Just like they didn't really believe that wind and solar would grow. I don't think they really believe that people are going to stop using gas. We are going to get rid of gas in our home that we are very slow at renovating. And so it's not an issue of anything except we're trying to do too much research, and therefore we don't renovate our house. We have like a hole in the wall for 4 years. But anyway, we're starting to renovate. We had a guy come over yesterday and we explained we were going to get rid of this gas hookup. And he said, why would you do that? Gas is so cheap and gas is so great. Like, within the climate community, it might feel like the revolution is coming for building electrification, but like, that is a niche audience. And we've managed to break into like the Berkeley new buildings, not even the like existing buildings, right? So I think they don't really believe it. And there's other issues, whereas wind and solar in particular, if you're in a restructured electricity system, it shaves peak prices in terms of the peak prices that are offered in the market, and that really reduces the amount of money you're paid for your existing plants. So I think a lot of what utilities are doing is they're looking what's on their books today. They got their debt, they have their equity, they kind of just manage that. It's a slow moving portfolio, and they really are not very good at thinking about the future. So in the book, I talk about Kahneman, or no, not Kahneman. I want to say the tortoise and hare, and it's wrong. The hedgehogs and the foxes. Yes, foxes and the hedgehogs, which is, who is it? Tversky? No, not Kahneman. Tversky. Feynman? I can't remember. Anyway, it's in my book, and I'm having a moment. But, the hedgehogs are the ones that don't really see the future, that they struggle to forecast. And I talk about how utilities are like hedgehogs. So I think that that's part of the issue. And then they really just have to negotiate deals for what are they going to do for their existing assets. So a lot of the transition is actually about managing what we call stranded costs in the utility space. You could also call like stranded assets in another sense, which is basically coal plants in particular. You might think, oh, they were built decades ago, so they're paid off. Well, no, the mercury air toxic standard comes into place, and you can see these cool figures where the debt goes up, they pay it off. Well, then they have to retrofit it. The debt goes back up again. It's kind of like renovating your house, right? You maybe take out a mortgage, but then you take out another loan to like renovate it or something. That's what utilities have been doing. And so they still have an enormous amount of debt on these very old assets. And so they have to either operate them for longer, which is what happened in Ohio, where they secured a bailout. And I'm talking like $5 billion bailout for these two coal plants. And that doesn't even include the third coal plant that I get into all the thorny details of that in my book. It's very bad. Or in New Mexico, the happier story, where they say, this is a deal with PNM, where they said, it's called the Energy Transition Act. They say, you're going to shut down that plant, and we're going to pay you the full cost as if you were continuing to operate that, right? So, but that's like a negotiation that actually has to happen, and the utility has to be willing to come to the table to take that deal, which means there has to be some threat. So in a lot of states where they've captured the Public Utility Commission, they captured the state legislature, they don't feel any need to have to change sort of business as usual. So that's where maybe some of these public power campaigns, the climate activists can put pressure that maybe brings utilities to the table, and that they start thinking a bit more forward thinking. Now, there are some exceptions like Xcel Energy, which I think is really getting the business opportunity here, because it's not just electrification that's the opportunity. The other thing is you get to continue to pay for your old stuff and build a lot of new stuff. Wind, solar, all these things. And that's actually how utilities make money. The more costs they have, the more money that they, the whole cost of service regulation model. So there are some utilities that I think are starting to get it, but it's slow. And maybe it'll be like a flood breaking, and one will get it and another one will get it. And before you know it, the whole utility industry will be flipped being allies. But they are certainly not allies today, unfortunately.
We've got a couple questions from the audience that I'd like to get to. So a question from Jimmy, who's a graduate student in ARE, Agriculture and Resource Economics. For those of us headed into the regulatory weeds as analysts post-graduation, what is the best way for us to help foster and accelerate a transition to a more just and low carbon future from the quote inside, e.g., raising these issues constantly with our superiors/commissioners, trying to foster outreach to a more diverse set of voices in regulatory design processes, etc.
Fran, do you have ideas, or do you want me to take this one?
You should jump in first.
Okay. Well, bureaucrats and policymakers of various stripes can actually have a lot of power. It tends to be when the issue is less politicized and salient, and with climate, that's a little hard, but that doesn't mean that there aren't like proceedings or issues that are going to come up that are a little bit off the radar of the utility or off the radar of the public, where you can make a really big difference. For example, in Arizona in the 1990s, that's actually when Arizona enacted its first clean energy target. It was quite early in 1996 initially. And that idea came from a bureaucrat working in the Public Utility Commission. But then the whole issue got a lot more politicized, and I don't think a bureaucrat could really do that today. But there could be new ideas coming down the pipe, maybe things that are a little less hot topics, things like performance-based regulation, things that haven't been politicized yet. And that's why I say that I think it's so important to have a more clear reform agenda for public utility commissions, because I don't actually think we know, other than the intervenor compensation program, which would probably require statute, so to go through a legislature. I don't think we know what it is we are wanting to do or what we want to pass, apart from clean electricity standards. So I think being smart and seeing opportunities and being a policy entrepreneur, don't underestimate that. A lot of the people I studied in the book who made huge impacts, people didn't even realize what they're doing at the time. So for example, there's a graduate of ERG, whose name I will, of course, Tom Stars, I think is his name. He graduated in the early 1990s. He wrote his thesis on, I think his PhD student, he wrote his thesis on net metering. He went to some solar energy conference and was like, what should I study? And somebody was like, net metering. And so he learned about that. And then he ended up going state by state to legislatures and got a lot of the early bills passed. So when I showed that figure, he was working in the late 1990s and got a bunch of these state legislatures to pass these laws. And people weren't really paying attention. The utilities didn't believe it was much of a big deal. They thought this was like off-grid solar. And so I don't know what the net metering of today is, but if you see opportunities like that and you can become a policy entrepreneur, it's huge. That is the largest lever we have. And this is why I get so annoyed by, don't fly and don't, eat meat and be as pure as you can be. No, you're educated, you have skills and knowledge. If you find levers, pull them and use the fog of enactment to your advantage, where other people don't necessarily know what you're doing, right? You don't necessarily need to make the fight bigger. Sometimes you want it to be small and to be kind of quiet and to just sneak some things through, and then it can have longer term consequences. So that's not a specific piece of advice. It's more of a strategy and a way of operating. But yeah, I think it's really important, and we are all cogs in the wheel trying to chip away at the carbon intensive status quo. So, stay in the fight, and it's great that you want to do that kind of work.
Yeah, I would definitely echo the fact that so much of this gets done in the weeds, and there are just these critical decisions that get made at this level that maybe 3 people really understand what's going on. And typically those 3 people are the people who have an interest in the financial outcome of this, right? Those are the ones who really have a stake in understanding what's going on. So having someone who kind of understands it and kind of is working in the public interest to make good policy, that by itself, don't underestimate how important that is. And Leah draws attention in her book to kind of regulatory capacity and state capacity, and it's such an important variable. And you see it, because in the absence of people working in the public interest, these regulations get made by people not working in the public interest, by people working in private interest. And there's an example. I had a friend who knows a ton about the climate, the cap and trade system in California. And there's this question of how utilities were able to count out of state emissions, and it was just I know quite a lot about climate policy, and he had to explain it to me 5 times, and still don't totally understand. But it was absolutely critical to the total emissions cap in California, and it basically undermined the way they set this regulation, undermined a lot of the how binding that the cap was in California. Is kind of significantly depressed the price in the carbon market. And so it's just because people aren't paying attention, it doesn't mean it's not important. And then I think thinking strategically, and also again, this is an idea in Leah's book about the feedbacks involved. And something is small today, but if you can be strategic about what it is you do and how you set it up and how you kind of align the interests, you can really have a cycle of you create these constituencies, you create these interests that then kind of further that and that work. So it doesn't all have to be big right away. And I think so kind of paying attention to that, I think, is you can like do really important stuff.
Yeah, like that's why the intervenor compensation program works. Ultimately, it's a feedback process, right? Like
Yep.
it doesn't really do anything to pass the intervenor compensation program, except it starts to pay advocates who have more money, who can show up, and then they can change other policies. And then before you know it, you get this sort of virtuous cycle. So yeah, the sequencing of things and thinking about what kinds of policies build power is a really important thing.
Okay, final, we're getting close to the end of the time. So I have one question that I like to ask anyone in the California energy world. So PG&E is just, coming out of bankruptcy, facing, lots of kind of structural challenges from both trying to figure out its role with the rise of CCAs and figuring out, what its future, whether it'll get out of the procurement business entirely, not to mention facing potential, huge shutoffs in the fall, power shutoffs potentially like we saw last year or maybe worse. My question is, what if you were Governor Newsom, how would you handle PG&E, and what would your vision be for reforming PG&E?
Yeah, well, that's like above my pay grade, I would say. I think Governor Newsom has a real flaming hot turd there. There are no good options, as my view. People might be familiar with this idea of inverse condemnation, which I believe is in the California Constitution, which is the idea that if you're a utility and you have a spark that caused, that ignited some little fire and then it spread all these various other places, like you're actually responsible for all the subsequent damages. And that's where in part the PG&E bankruptcy comes from. I used to know the exact number, but I think it might be 30 billion just from I think that's the 2018 season. So not last year, but the year before. I think that's when Paradise was. That's a lot of money for like one utility company for one fire season. So that's why the company's in part in bankruptcy. And sometimes people tell me, no, that's not true. I was like, well, actually, that's a lot of money for one utility for one season. So yeah, I think it is partially why they're in bankruptcy. So so what are the choices? The state can take over PG&E, but actually, unless they change the law, which they could do, the state then becomes liable for all those future damages, right? So now they're taking on this company that's in kind of rough shape, that has a lot of infrastructure that hasn't been well maintained, that's likely to cause all these sparks, and now they've got to run it. And I'm not saying PG&E is a great company, but it's actually probably very difficult to figure out which lines you should be turning off at what time, and how to balance turning off people's electricity, which has healthcare implications, economic implications for people like losing food that's in their freezers or whatever else. Like there are negative costs to turning off the power, and it makes people angry, of course, politically. And actually, Maddo and I have research on that. We did a survey in the field during the public safety power shutoffs in the Bay Area in October. One of a bajillion projects that we haven't even analyzed yet because the world is insane. But anyway, that has costs. Or if you don't shut off the power, or you shut it off wrong and you don't have a good map and you still strike a fire, well, now you've upset people because you turned on the power and you've created a fire. And so if the government is in charge of that, they probably won't do a great job because it's a really hard problem. And then they'll be stuck holding both the political cost, where people are going to be angry at the government, and they'll be stuck with the financial bill. So, from a political perspective, I don't know if it's a great idea. And I think that this just shows how climate change puts us in impossible situations, right? Like, yes, PG&E is a company that's done terrible things, like the San Bruno pipeline explosion, right? Like I could list many things that PG&E has done bad. I'm not saying they're a good company, but the state taking them over and then being responsible for it is really complicated. And as I already talked about earlier, the state breaking them up, the little pieces, that creates huge problems too in terms of cost sharing and how we maintain a lot of infrastructure. And when people talk about like burying transmission lines, the costs are really astronomical. I don't remember, again, I used to know the exact amount per mile, but it's like a lot of money per mile. And there's lots of miles of of lines to put underground transmission. And then you also have like the distribution system, like sparks can happen across the system. So I think it's a terrible situation, and I think it underlines how expensive climate change is. And I don't know what should be done about PG&E, which I feel bad about saying, but sometimes it's important to just recognize that you don't know the answer. What about you, Fran?
Yeah, I mean that's a stumper for the last. I mean, I agree with what Leah said, that like, you know, I don't think there's any you know, there are no pat answers to this is a real structural problem here. And yes, you know, part of the story is kind of some, you know, yeah, mismanagement by PG&E, but like, you know, going forward, you know, what do we do? I don't think there's any good answers. And I also point to it as an example of like how climate change risks play out in like complicated, you know, we had a drought caused a ton of trees to die. We've had climate change probably causing shifts in the rainy season, and particularly in terms of, you know, when it starts raining in the fall. It's lengthened fire season, right? So like the fire risk just looks really different right now than it, you know, than it had than before. And over on top of that, you've kind of layered kind of you know, the actions of PG&E, and you know that now they're kind of liable for like all kind of the wildfire risk. When there's a lot of factors that are contributing to that wildfire risk, and climate change being one of them. And you know, who would have thought that, you know, kind of connected climate change to like, you know, the power being shut off in the Bay Area for like, you know, 10 days in some places. I mean, that's crazy. Like no one could have imagined that, and yet here we are. And like, you know, it just these things play out in complicated ways. And like, you know, yeah, sorry, this is like long and rambling to say that I don't have any good solutions for PG&E.
But this points out my point to Fran, which I don't need to make to Fran because Fran knows what I'm saying. Like climate change costs money, you know, it costs so much money. It's going to mess up our economies, and why we can't delay anymore. Now, the good thing is, let's say we did underground stuff or we actually took on the problem. Guess what? It would create so much work. Sometimes I think about how we have to retrofit every building. We have to change every car, and it's insane. And then you think, well, that's a lot of work for people to do. So that's the good side of the bad story.
So how do you both like deal psychologically with thinking about climate every day?
Jake had to sneak in another one called "I'm too depressed by this conversation." How do you guys cope? I mean, I guess I do by the way I've said already, that I try to chip away at it, and that I just believe that we've never really tried before. And you know, I guess I've become a kind of techno-optimist in some funny ways, which is hilarious because I definitely wasn't for a long time. But sometimes I think about, you know, drawdown technologies, negative emissions technologies, I don't know, breakthrough in liquid storage. I don't know. Sometimes I think that if we tried, we could figure some stuff out and start to solve the problem. But there's not a lot of time to do that anymore.
I like thinking about, you know, just how big. I don't think we should, if, you know, sometimes it's easy to forget just what we're trying to do here. And like, this is providing a public good at a global scale for like on a century's time scale. And like the world has never done this. I mean, maybe the ozone hole, you could like, maybe like this little like, you know, kind of CFCs. But this is really big, right? What we're trying to do. And like, I think we should just respect that and like acknowledge like it's going to be hard, you know, and like the economic interest, you know, the power involved in you know, that has to be kind of taken on to make this change. It's like, it's enormous. And so we should expect it to be hard. But I think, you know, people recognize now what the fight at least looks like, right? We're not kind of in the fiction that, you know, this isn't a fight, because it is. And so I, you know, think about what that means about us as a society, as a species, that we can do this if we can. And I'm not sure we can, but if we can, it, you know, that's an amazing advance in terms of cooperation. And I think it says something good about the future. And I live and work in hope that we will solve this.
Alrighty, well, that was a really interesting and exciting conversation. Thank you very much, Leah and Fran, for joining. Once again, Leah Stokes' new book is Short Circuiting Policy. Looks like this, and you should all buy it. It finally came after a long delay. However, you can also find it if you're a UC student. You can get a free copy online through the UC library. That's got like a digital that you can check out. So I will, if you guys have follow-up questions for Leah and Fran, their contact info is easily searchable, and I might send that out as well. And I encourage you to follow both of them on Twitter. Leah will occasionally tweet extremely informative threads. So thank you for that public service, Leah. And
my last one was about the bailouts. So there you go. The fossil fuel bailouts. Yeah.
Boo. We don't like those. Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we will see you in the future.